And welcome back to Meeting of the Minds. We have our first repeat visitor, the great Charles Coulombe. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Absolutely. So you were saying before about how tranquil and peaceful everything is right now in the world, the U.S.
Oh gosh, it's. I'll tell you, the entire planet is wrapped in somnolence. Everybody's passed out with good reason, but they're dreaming about riots and looting, and politicians with no brains yapping pointlessly, like something out of H.P. Lovecraft. I mean, in the country of the idiotic, the moron is king.
That's right.
And there we are.
That's where we're at.
I mean, let me explain something. All right, I'm an old guy. I'm turning 60 this year. The very day, the 60th anniversary of JFK's election. The apogee of the kind of sellout Catholicism that made us what we are. Well, I got to tell you, when I was 12, 13 years old and Roe v. Wade came in, I accepted that my masters and rulers were evil. And I accepted that. Why, you ask? Well, I don't have a choice. Your owners are who own you. You don't get the choice there. I know you get to vote, and that makes so much difference. And actually it does. I'll touch on that momentarily. But not on a national level. And God knows you can't vote for the Supreme Court. Which brings us back to Roe v. Wade. So I accepted the fact that my masters were evil. But I also knew enough history, even as a boy, to know that lots of people have lived under evil rulers. But, managed. You live your life, you do what you do, and with any luck, they don't beat you or kill you. But then, under Jimmy Carter, and again, not just because of him, it's not like he was the great supreme jefe, but it was a concatenation of circumstances that led me to the realization. I realized also that my masters were not simply evil, they were nuts. They were insane. And by that, I don't mean to say cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs. What I mean is that their internal vision of reality was more important to them than reality. That's what I mean by insane. Right. Kind of like the Nazis, who preferred being defeated to giving up their racial policies, which is, if they hadn't put in their racial policies, they'd have won on the Eastern Front. But because they had to be chasing after Slavs and Jews, well, they lost, deservedly. Because anybody who puts their own twisted view of reality over actual reality, in my book, deserves what they get. Which brings us to number 3. Long about the reign of Mr. Obama, and again, not simply because of him, just as it wasn't simply because of Mr. Carter, I came to realize my owners are evil, which is bad. They're insane, which, not really very good either. But you know what else? They're actually stupid. They're really very stupid. And this is a hard realization for people to accept, because we'd like to think that if the people at the helm are evil and insane, they at least know what they're doing. But you see, they don't. You've seen this big stupefaction in American society. The whole time I've been alive, people were always yapping about the dumbing down of education, the dumbing down of public discourse, the dumbing down of this, that, and the other. The dumbing down of the mass. Everything has to be dumbed down because we get stupider and stupider. All right, fine. What we didn't understand was that it wasn't just affecting us helots and peasants. It was also affecting the ruling classes. They knew less and less as well. And now you've got a situation where you've got mayors talking in the face of rioting, talking about defunding the police, abolishing the police, put everything else aside. That is just bloody cray-cray. And, and my favorite part is that if you even wonder about what would happen, you're a white supremacist. Now, again, this is what I mean by stupid. But see, the problem here, as my late father used to say, is that when you're stupid, bad things happen. Because stupid is not a good quality. And just put everyone's mind at rest. Evil isn't a good quality. Insanity isn't a good quality either. I'm not praising them. But of the three, stupidity is the worst. And the reason why it's the worst is that a stupid person doesn't know enough to come in out of the rain. And so you don't know, you can't predict them. You can't negotiate around them because they're dumb.
So it's the most dangerous.
Yeah, it really is. You know, Eric von Kuehne-Ledin, who was one of the greatest historians and commentators I know of, had a wonderful phrase. He said, everyone knows that one part of any historical event is conspiracy and one part is catastrophe. Now, where you get the arguments over, of course, is the proportion to each. You know, how much of the American Revolution was catastrophe, how much of it was conspiracy, or the blowing up of the Maine, or the Youngstown flood. You know, I mean, you whatever. That's where the arguments come in, and people will argue everywhere from Sunday. But he said, the part that never gets its just due, and it's at least as important as the other two, is stupidity. That just doesn't get its due because, in a way, we human beings are so proud of ourselves that we don't like to admit that extra factor. Because it reflects badly on us. I mean, if my masters can be stupid, and they've been to Ivy League schools, it means, oh no, I don't want to finish that thought. It's too horrifying even to contemplate. But at any rate, to bring this rant to a close, as you can imagine, I've just been watching the news, and it's bad for my liver. But I'm old enough to remember the long, hot summer of '67. Now, what we like to remember, of course, is the summer of love in San Francisco, with flowers in our hair, and, you know, Scout McKenzie and all that. And yeah, it was like that in San Francisco. The rest of the country, it was the long, hot summer with race riots all over the place. Some of them so bad, as in Newark and Detroit, that the cities never recovered. They don't talk about that. People your age have no idea that both Newark and Detroit were once not the shambling wrecks that they are now. They were actually going concerns, you know, cities with downtowns that people went to, and, you know, lives and stuff. But that is how bad those riots were. But we've forgotten. Now, what our lords and masters and or whoever, you know, again, at the risk, I don't pretend to have a handle on these things or know. You know, is it Antifa pretending to be Boogaloo Boys pretending to be Antifa? Either of them pretending to be BLM or vice versa? Who knows? I don't know. Was it George Soros supplying the bricks? Or did they come from the Republican Party's slush fund? I have no idea. What I do know is that I suspect the outcome of all this is not just going to be another term for Mr. Trump. Because, again, thinking back to the long, hot summer, that is what put Mr. Nixon into the White House. Really, more than any other single thing. Because, as a rule, when people are frightened, they don't vote Democratic. You know, that's something that these guys don't understand. If this stuff doesn't stop, you're going to see the election of 1972, not 68. But 68, as I say, nobody could imagine Hubert Humphrey taking care of the United States. I mean, I'm sorry, nobody even remembers Hubert Humphrey, but I think of that poor guy. I feel very bad for Hubert Humphrey. Now, look him up, you'll know why. Anyway, this is all ancient history, but it's on my mind very much because, of course, this is all bringing back memories, flashbacks to my childhood. But see, in those days, we had something called police departments, and we had a thing called a mayor. And see, in those days, mayors didn't lick the boots of rioters. They sent out the Polizei and sometimes the National Guard to put the thing down. Now, you can argue, if you want, you can argue, well, they're rioting and all this because of oppression and blah. Stop. Let me just ask this question to everyone who wants to come up with an explanation for why the rioting and the looting is all right. And I want you to listen real carefully. How oppressed do I have to be before you think it's okay for me to burn down your house or your business? At what point does my oppression reach this? Now, I'm not talking about other people. I mean, you. When you see your house go up in flames, is that a good thing? I know it's your privilege that you even live in a house. I get it. Fine. You know, and there are people like that. NPR, this one individual suggested that no one read white literature anymore. Well, you know what? No, I'm with them. And I believe that anyone who believes that and feels that way should stop wearing white clothing, stop using white technology, eating white food, or using white medicine, or speaking white languages. No more English. I need people like that to express themselves in indigenous languages. I'm willing to wait for them to learn. No, really. I mean, however long it takes for them to learn, not Swahili, because that was a slave language. It was invented by the Arabs so they could speak to their property.
Really?
Yeah. Where'd you think it came from? It's sort of a pidgin. It's an Arabic it's like a lingua franca. I mean, it's the same thing that on the frontier here, the different pidgin dialects they came up with to speak to the Indians or in the South Seas, same kind of stuff. So, you know, I'm willing for them to take the time as long as it takes. But of course, I don't want to hear them use any Western style technology to get their message across. And God knows if they're going to tag, they mustn't tag in any language known to a European.
The elusive obvious. Once you attack the premise, the house falls down.
Well, and I say go for the premise the way you would for the jugular.
Makes sense.
I mean, well, see, this is the problem. A lot of people get all excited about the side issues and the conclusions. Let's look at the premise first. I mean, you know, everyone agrees that slavery was a terrible thing. But the biggest beneficiaries of slavery today, next to white Americans, are black Americans. Because the alternative is that they would be living in Africa. And most of Africa is not a nice place to live in. And that may sound awful, but it's true. I mean, one of my best black friends in California came back from a tour of the west coast of Africa, where his ancestors were from. And I asked him, so, see, how was it? How was the motherland? And he looked at me and he said, Charles, I swear to God, I never thought I would say this. But he said, thank God for slavery. Until you've seen somebody with a Congo eel, you don't know what life's like.
Wow. Yeah.
All I can do.
Good.
That's all I can say about that. I will say, though, that there is an alternative. I call it the Back To movement. Now, it's a very simple thing. Forget everything I've said. Everything. Throw it right out the window. I have a whole new opinion. The Back To movement. Now, I have to admit, it's inspired by Marcus Garvey and the Back to Africa movement. All the blacks going back to Africa. All of us whites must go back to Europe. And see, I've led the charge. I'm here now. All the Asian folk have to go back to China, Japan, Korea, Vietnam, wherever they come from. Really, everybody's got to go home. Everybody, including the Indians. They've got to go back over the land bridge into Siberia or wherever they want to go in Eurasia. Everyone's got to go home.
What if you're half Italian, half Polish? Where do I go?
Well, I mean, I've got the same problem. I'm half French Canadian, quarter Austrian, quarter English. It doesn't matter. See, because Americans are so mixed, just get out. Because Americans are so mixed, I mean, and it's tough for people who are multiracial. which one do they go to? The only thing I can suggest is that you go to wherever you're most of. If you're more black than white, go to Africa. If you're more white than black, go to Europe. If you're half and half, flip a coin. But everybody go home. Leave North America to its rightful owners. The grizzly bears, the wolves, the foxes, and be sure to blow up everything as you leave.
Yep.
What? I think that's a great idea. All kidding aside, I really am fit to be tied, and the stupidity has come to Britain, and Australia. There was this very funny thing. There was a lady named Jacqueline Diamond, who was an Australian woman, no criminal record, who was shot dead by a black Minneapolis cop. And so they've got this Australian Indian chap going around interviewing Australians who are demonstrating about the events in Minneapolis. And he's asked, well, have you heard of Jacqueline Diamond? Well, no one has. So, the marching morons, ladies and gentlemen. Idiocracy has arrived.
That's it. Well, as Aquinas talked about how high prudence was as far as the virtues, right? The chief among virtues, or whatever he said. But then the opposite of that prudence would probably be stupidity. So that's why that's probably the most dangerous.
Yeah, although it's a virtue now. But I must tell you, I'm saying Camacho in 2016. Or 2020, rather. 2020. That's right. I know what I'm talking about. 2020. President Camacho. He knows.
That's it.
Honestly, all kidding aside, just for a second, the thing that I hate most of all is to see the bonds in this country, or that country, I should say, since I'm not actually there at the moment, being ripped apart. That is the most painful thing. And I know what the results will probably be. At the end of the day, if you make opposition to white supremacy synonymous with rioting and burning and looting, you're going to make white supremacy look good. There's just no way around that. And there will be an unpleasant reaction one day. I don't know how soon. But unless this stops, it won't look good. I mean, already you've got things like the Latin Kings in Chicago going after the rioters. In Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, a busload and some cars full of would-be looters and rioters came from Spokane, Washington to loot downtown Coeur d'Alene. Unfortunately, Coeur d'Alene probably is not a good place to try that, because they were met not by the police of Coeur d'Alene, but a band of armed citizens.
Boy. Yeah.
And, they were basically given a choice to turn around or get shot. And they very wisely chose the better part and turned tail. If this stuff doesn't stop, you're going to start seeing more and more of that. And the worst places will be places where they're talking about defunding or abolishing the police, because there will be vigilantes. People will take things into their own hands, and the result will not be pretty. And worse yet, in such places, I don't know how effective law enforcement is going to be on its own. Because if I were a cop and I'm being abused by the mayor and or city council, I don't know, but that blue flu might be deadlier than the coronavirus. So that's just my 2 cents worth, but
we got to pray. We got to pray and do whatever we can our little end, right? Even if it's small.
Stay sane, ladies and gentlemen. Stay sane, whatever you can. Remember, people are individuals. They are not groups. Don't blame people for the shortcomings, the apparent shortcomings of whatever group they happen to belong to.
Yep. Key point.
Yeah, keep sane inside insanity, as the Rocky Horror Picture Show informs us.
That's it. All right, so I have a notepad that has a whole section that says Coulombe questions.
Ooh, that's scary. All right. Well,
so
I've paid my bill with my ranting, so it's your turn.
All right, so now as an open monarchist that I've probably never said on the air before the first time we spoke, I sounded like a monarchist. Now I would say that I am a monarchist. So I start to think about, okay, what are the implications there? So I wrote to you about, I pledged allegiance to the flag and to the republic for which it stands. As a kid. So now I think, I remember you speaking about some of the founding fathers being traitors. Granted, they were, of age of, they were over 18 and they took active steps against the country they swore allegiance to. So does that make me a traitor?
No, it doesn't. It doesn't for several reasons. Number one, a republic is not a person. I've certainly taken the same. I took the oath of allegiance to defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. Now, obviously, if the military took that 100% as written, they'd have to turn their guns on the government, which, the Supreme Court would have been blown to bits years ago. But, if that isn't a clear and present danger to the Constitution, I don't know what is. But, the Supreme Court is the best example I've ever seen of the old saying, the fox in the hen house. But seriously, no, the Republic as it stands is the established governance of this place. There is not per se a claimant to the throne of America. If you recall, and even if you don't recall, it's still the case. My whole fun with Star Spangled Crown was the creation of an American monarchy, basically from bits and pieces, and that's the great irony, because our republic, in many, many ways, is a monarchy without a king. All of our legal roots, even most of our constitutional roots, lie in one or another monarchy. It's just have been sort of pulled out of context and thrown together and patched up sometimes, some way in there. But there is no heir to the throne here. George III absolved his subjects of their allegiance. The current heir to the Stuart claims isn't interested in the thrones of England, Scotland, and Ireland, let alone America. The King of Spain could care less, although his father did send us some very nice statues, so that's something. And then as far as France goes, though I'm very much a legitimist, I don't think either the legitimists or the Orleanist claimants have any interest in Middle America, especially not after the hand of Louis XVI was yanked off his statue in Louisville. Stupid people. Stupid bloody people. A day, I have no doubt, if I live long enough, a day is going to come when I find myself fighting to keep the statues of civil rights figures intact. I have absolutely... What's that?
We've seen different statues and things that were either vandalized or graffiti that were of civil rights leaders.
Yep, and it's just it'll get worse. I knew it. I promise I'm not going to go back on the tangent. But I knew when all this stuff started, they were ripping open wounds that should not be ripped open. One of the greatest accomplishments in this country's history was the fact that 50 years after the end of the bloodiest war we've ever fought, and bear in mind the Civil War killed more Americans than all the other wars we've fought put together. And 50 years later, they were having a reunion at Gettysburg with elderly Confederate and Union vets. The elderly Confederates running down the hill, reliving Pickett's charge, and the Union vets waiting for them, literally with open arms. And believe me when I tell you that America in 1913 was not a huggy place, but they hugged each other. I cannot think of another country in the world that could accomplish that. And some of my earliest memories of the last years of the Civil War centennial, and that was the theme, was the joint valor of both sides, which is what you have to do if you're trying to put the pieces back together of a country sundered by civil war. But when you're stupid, you don't understand that because you're stupid. And when you're stupid and in charge, you add to your ignorance arrogance. And I guarantee you there is nothing worse in life than arrogance and ignorance together in the same person sitting on the chair.
Right. It's definitely frustrating. And it just seems like, I guess, at that time during the Civil War, it wasn't as far removed from the crown and from Christ the King. The more time that goes by, the further removed from the crown, and absolutely further removed from Christ the King.
Then the crazier we get.
Yeah.
And of course, remember that despite our whatever conscious stupidities we have, on an unconscious level, we do have certain connections to reality. And on some level, we know that the value of another human being comes from the fact that he too is a creation of God. That's his value. It's not from his class or his race or his country or anything else. It's the fact that God created him in his own image, the way he created you and me. That's what a person's value comes from. Now, if someone denies that, then other people lose their value. And you end up in a world of one. And that one is you. The problem is you're surrounded by a ton of other people who feel the same way.
Yeah.
But anyway, I digress.
But that's immanentism, right? That's where people start judging reality based on themselves. I think I was just listening to a G.K. Chesterton lecture or about G.K. Chesterton who was speaking about something like that. Yeah,
and it's insanity.
Yeah. It
is insanity. Because we may try to avoid it and try to hide it. But, you know, there's a wonderful cartoon. I really love it. It shows this chick walking out of a window in a skyscraper. And she's just she's put one foot out. And she's obviously going to walk the whole way. And her thought balloon says, gravity is a social construct.
Yep. That would be insane. When you start making yourself the arbiter of reality, that's insane. That's
which is what our lords and masters do, and what they've encouraged their slaves to do. That's us.
Whereas the loony bin used to be only a few people, now we've said, you know what? Now the whole world is going to be the loony bin.
A big asylum without any staff, and God knows we're not having meals delivered regularly, and we have to pay for them ourselves. I don't know, you know. I can't wait to complain to the chief of this asylum because it's just not working for me. Anyway, what's your next question?
Okay. So to get it straight, Washington and many or all the signers of the Declaration of Independence swore allegiance to the king.
Any of them, I can't say all. Any of them who held office, which is probably all, but I can't swear to it. Any of them that held office under the king or served in the militia. During the war, the war against my ancestors. Not that I'm bitter, although George Washington did cause that war. Not that I'm bitter. No, I mean, I have to admit, Washington was actually a very remarkable individual. And it's important to bear in mind that the generation of the founders were formed under a monarchy.
Right.
And by their actions ensure that we would never have so eminent a generation again.
That's right. I got a kick out of that when you said that last time. That's awesome.
So, well, it's a little bit like the fathers of Vatican II. You know, people like Karl Rahner and all that ensured that there would never be clerics as well educated as they were again.
Yes, that's an excellent point. So Washington and a lot of these signers, they were traitors because they betrayed their oath to the king. But we are not traitors because we made an oath to the flag and the republic, not to a person.
Not to a person, and mind you, there's also the fact that it's not as though any American monarchist would ever work against the interests of his country. Because
the Constitution, we talk about freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom of press, which I think in the papal encyclicals of the 19th century, they were saying limited freedom of speech, limited freedom of press, and no freedom of religion.
And of course, it's important to bear in mind, though, that one thing the Constitution did do for us is that it ended the penal laws and it allowed Catholics, if they wished, emphasis on if they wished, to evangelize their neighbors. We were given, because of the revolution, we were given an historical opportunity to evangelize this country. And we failed. We didn't do it. As I say, I was born the day of the apogee of that kind of sellout Catholicism. We got one of our own in the White House. Oh boy, isn't that just groovy?
Could a Catholic? Good.
Well, as Catholic as a Kennedy can be.
Could a Catholics become a Supreme Court justice? I know we have Supreme Court justices that are Catholic, but could they rightly swear to protect a constitution that doesn't rightly address the importance of Christ the King?
Well, they could, only in the sense that certainly Leo XIII was big on the fact that in a country where Catholics are not the majority, we basically have to be satisfied with whatever we can get. That is to say that in a primarily Catholic country, the church requires various rights and privileges. It's not quite the same in a country that is not primarily Catholic. Of course, I would argue that while that's true, the reason why the country is not primarily Catholic is because its Catholics failed it.
Right.
So you're in this weird situation, and as I say, I don't think I know of a single American monarchist who would favor the violent overthrow of the government as it stands, or would work for the country's enemies. You know, it's not like we'd be spying for Britain or the Netherlands because they've got kings. It's a very different kind of thing. Whereas the founding fathers did ally with His Majesty's enemies, France, Spain, and the Netherlands. But it's a very different thing. But I mean, I cannot imagine a case where if the United States went to war, I would not do my utmost for the United States. You know, it's a very different thing entirely. Now, mind you, the byproducts of the revolution were bad all around. They didn't do France and Spain any good because of his intervention in, which I consider his single great era in his entire reign. Louis XVI, by backing the American rebels, did two things. He bankrupted France, and that meant that a few years later, when the great volcano exploded in Iceland, and they had a year without a summer and the crops failed, he couldn't do what he normally would have done, which was to either buy grain on credit or open up the royal granaries. The granaries were empty and he had no credit, thanks to the American War. So that led to the Great Hunger, and in turn that led to calling the Estates General and so forth, which the other unfortunate result of it, well, there are two others actually, it turned George III against Catholic emancipation because he felt betrayed by his Catholic brother monarchs of France and Spain. And it had the effect of, well, as Eric Nelson puts it in his book, The Royalist Revolution, he says when the whole thing was finished, on this side of the water you would have a monarchy without a king, and on the other side a king without a monarchy. And from that time in Britain, you've had this slow but steady separation of the ceremonial aspects of government from the practical aspects. And that in Britain is at every level. So, you know, you've got the king versus the prime minister, the House of Lords versus the House of Commons, Lord Lieutenant and High Sheriff versus the Chief of the County Council, all the way down to Mayor, Lord Mayor versus City Council. So, which, in my humble opinion, has not been a good thing for Britain. So the most you could say for it is that it started us on a course which led to our becoming the greatest power on earth. But what benefit that has brought us is another issue.
Right.
I had an interesting conversation with my best friend, who's German, when we first met back in '92 at Oxford, so you see. But he asked me, Charles, how long do you Americans get for summer vacation? I said, well, if we get one, it's usually a week, or if you're in, really good, really well placed, 2 weeks. I goes, what? We get 6 weeks. I said, well, yes, but you see, it's the price we pay for having the strongest economy in the world. And he says, but what good does that do you if you don't actually benefit from it? And my response to that was, you shut up with that kind of defeatist talk. It's because we put our nose to the grindstone that we've got the strongest economy in the world. But who does it benefit? I said, I told you. You stop that. Why? I oughta. Well, you get the idea.
Right. We do certain things because we think it's going to make us happy. And then it doesn't, and it's not, then we wind up going crazy. But, well, I think that's another Chesterton thing, right? That too much focus on health makes you unhealthy. Too much focus on this makes you that. That's something. So now Pope Leo XIII, if I'm understanding that correctly, he said, so it's, if you're not in a Catholic country, you do the best you can with where you're at, right? In terms of the religion, you can't, is that what you were saying? That you can't generalize with the Catholic principles? Did I freeze?
You did a moment ago. You did, but now you're back to normal. If there is such a thing, I don't want to impose my views on others. So I don't want to make normality something that has to be had.
Okay. Now, did that open up the floor for Vatican II Dignitatis Humani with freedom of religion? Is that related or no?
Well, yes and no. Yes, in the sense that a gentleman called Father John Courtney Murray, S.J., who is the major author of the Religious Liberty Decree at Vatican II, before Vatican II, he argued in several books, including We Hold These Truths, that the American settlement was actually truer to Catholic principles than the Catholic confessional state.
Now we're breaking up again. What is the deal?
Opponents. How about now?
For a second, looking good. You're moving your head. I think I see you.
I'm turning into a headbanger. All right. Am I back?
It's like a few seconds delayed, but I got you better now. Before you're
all right. Father, I think it was Joseph Fenton, was Father Murray's biggest opponent, and Father Connell was another one. And they argued basically, no, the American settlement is only the best possible alternative at the moment in the United States, but it shouldn't be taken as normative.
Okay.
It's an expedient, and that's it. Well, they argued back and forth, and Pius XII favored Fenton and Connell, but unfortunately he did not publicly condemn Murray. And so after Pius XII died, as happened with a lot of other people, Murray and so forth came out triumphant at the council. But it was written in such a way that if you twist your brain a little bit, you could make it accord with past teaching if you really want to. It's a funny thing because even its defenders, on the one hand, will tell you that, well, it's infallible, it comes from Vatican II, but it really represents a change in policy. Well, stop. If something represents a change in policy, it is by nature not infallible. Because it's mere policy and it's changeable, so it's not infallible truth. The argument of people like the SSPX is that they attempted to change infallible truth. The argument of people like Pope Benedict is no, they were simply trying to alter a contingent teaching according to changed circumstances. But you see, if that's true, then the change itself is contingent. You see what I'm saying? In other words, if you could change those teachings, then the changes themselves are no more to be. They're no more written in stone. Yeah. So, but you see, you can't have it both ways. You can't say they're changeable, but they're infallible.
Right. So this is. It seems on this topic we would lean more towards the SSPX position on this particular stance.
Not necessarily. I mean, you could. And I'm certainly not. I'm not in a position to judge in that sense. What I am saying is that it's sort of a heads I win, tails you lose, because either the SSPX are correct, in which case you can't change the former teaching because it's infallible, or they're not correct, you could change it, but in that case, it falls down not to what is orthodox, but what actually works. And if we look at what has actually happened since the church has adopted this policy, is, in the words of our Yiddish friends, bupkis, nothing. Because instead of the church claiming to be mother and teacher, the hierarchy have claimed instead to simply be collaborating with others of goodwill of any faith or none in building a more just society. Now, you could play with the theory behind that all you want, but what this comes down to in terms of the real world where people live is that Catholics are just along for the ride. Right. We're not driving the bus, we're passengers.
Right. That's what it seemed like with the council documents.
Exactly. That's what you end up with. Now, mind you, you can make the argument that it doesn't have to be that way from the council documents, and people do. And that's fine. I don't want to judge either the probity or the intellectuality of the people who try that. But what I will say, not as a theologian or philosopher, because I'm neither one, but as an historian, that's not how it worked out. How it worked out was the worst possible way. The independent voice of the church was absolutely silenced. And as additions to that, you had the adoption by all Catholic politicians, or almost all in the United States, of John F. Kennedy's pledge to the Houston Ministerial Association in the year of my birth, that he would not allow his religion to affect his conduct in office, in public life, and just to make sure it wouldn't affect his actions in public life, he made a point of not letting it affect his actions in private life either, on the off chance that it might somehow. He was doing it for the good of the country.
Oh, well, that's okay then.
Yeah, I just thought I'd emphasize that. But now 50 years later, Archbishop Chaput of Philadelphia, on the anniversary of the Houston Ministerial thing, condemned the ministerial speech. Now, mind you, it's 50 years later. And for that 50 years, as he pointed out, most Catholic American politicians use the Kennedy doctrine as an excuse to put their faith away in public life. And he said, not only is this a terrible thing for Catholics, it's a terrible disservice to the country, and he was perfectly right. Because one thing that it gets forgotten is that the Catholic views on these things are not simply based on being Catholic, based on making America Catholic. They also happen to work. You see. I mean, what has abortion and contraception actually brought us but a population implosion that has doomed Social Security and made it necessary to import tons of foreigners to work here and to consume here and to pay taxes here? Because the native-born aren't reproducing in sufficient numbers. So you see, violating church teaching isn't simply a bad thing for Catholics. In this area, it's violating natural law. And if you do that, bad things in the objective sphere will happen to you. And I have to say to people when they yap at me about this, all right, so what you're telling me is we do have enough native-born people to keep the wheels of commerce and industry turning, which is why we don't need immigrants. Is that what you're telling me? I'll go with it. I mean, the statistics, of course, don't support what you're saying, but I'll go with that. So now what? We don't have enough to replace the native-born population. It's as simple as that. And something has to be done. And again, this is why I hate getting into the immigration debate, because both sides don't want to touch this. Because that would mean attacking abortion, and it would mean attacking contraception. When the pro-immigration people go on about we need the immigrants, they're right. When the anti-immigration people go on about how immigration is altering the country and not always in a nice way, they're right too. Of course, what they leave out is the damage that's done to the immigrants by coming here and picking up our screwy culture, and worse yet, taking it back to Mexico or Central America. Nobody wants to talk about that either. We want to think we're raising the heathen. We're not. And what the church will not talk about is how so many of them come up here and lose the faith because there's no adequate pastoral care for them. But the good news is that it's not discrimination. There's no adequate pastoral care for Native Catholics either, so it's all right.
That's it. That makes it okay, as long as we're all equal.
Equality of neglect.
That's it. That's it. Okay, so yeah, it's a shame the storm that we're in with all this. But now, historically, if there's been a council like this, has there been councils, documents, I'm sure, that have been ambiguous? What's the precedent? What normally happens when you have something that could be interpreted one way or the other way? Is it we come out with the Syllabus of Errors Part 3, and then possibly also condemning the maybe the far right extreme traditional stance of nothing after the council was good. So that's got to
be. What's going to happen in all likelihood is that one day people will remember Vatican II the way they remember Lateran X.
And they'll just kind of, yeah.
And I guarantee you, if we're not in the last days, that in 600 years, people are really not going to remember this any more than we remember the pornocracy.
Yeah, it just feels like we open the door so much for all the modernism and all the liberalism that how would it then go back to the traditional Catholicism?
Well, it's very simple. Society collapses and has to be picked up from the bottom again. You know, lots of people die. Lots of people die stupid. And then, of course, the realities reassert themselves. When you realize you're not the center of the world, when you realize it's pray or die, when your wife is struggling with childbirth and is threatened with death, when you yourself have some foul disease, then you'll turn to prayer, and one of three things will happen. You'll recover and go on about your business in the way that we human beings do. You'll die reconciled to God and go to heaven or purgatory, or you'll die cursing him and you'll go to hell. That's what's going to happen for each and every one of us.
Right.
So, all right, let's ensure your other questions.
Change gears, another one. Okay, so we talked about before about Pius X supporting the Confederacy, that they should be independent.
Yep.
And that Karl Marx supported the Union. Now, did the Pope condemn the slavery portion? And then what is the Church's teachings on slavery? Is it an intrinsic evil, or is it sometimes permitted? Did he condemn that?
In 1867, 2 years afterwards, after the end of the war, the Holy Office issued a brief on slavery, and their basic thing was, it is not necessarily an intrinsic evil, but it certainly can give rise to all sorts of evils. And when Brazil abolished the slave trade in 1889, when Brazil abolished the slave trade in 1889, Leo XIII congratulated them on having, and he wrote a letter about slavery and why it, all in all, was not a good thing. But again, the Church has always stopped short of outright condemning it as an intrinsic evil. And the reason why that is because despite the many evils that arise from it, there was no such condemnation in Scripture. And you know,
to work off debt, or instead of being killed, they were enslaved, or working off debt as someone's slave.
Yeah, and they had the things of that nature. The problem with the endemic slavery that developed, the problem with the endemic slavery that developed, of course, is that it can give rise to so many other problems, and it really, how do I put this nicely? In the end, it was, while it was very brutalizing in a lot of ways, there are a few things that we tend to forget about it. And one is that human beings are human beings, and they tend to work their way around things. One of the great paradoxes of American history that nobody seems to have an answer for, and I certainly don't, is that in the 1830s, the South lived in deadly fear of a slave revolt, like Nat Turner's. This was just absolutely horrendous. Oh, heavens. You know what? I have another show I've got to do. What's that?
Oh, I'm sorry. I was saying, go ahead. I had myself on mute. Yeah, go ahead. We'll do it another time.
All right. Well, let me bring this to, I'm sorry. I'm double booked today.
No problem. I do it too.
All right. Well, let me just say very quickly that the great paradox with American history is that there was all this fear of slave revolts. The Civil War comes along. There's the vanishing, basically, of the entire white male population of the South to go fight the war. And the wives and children and plantations are left in the keeping of the slaves. And there were no slave revolts. Quite the contrary. Very often when Union troops would come to a given plantation, they would torture some of the slaves to find out where the master's silver was kept. And we have no records of that trust given them being violated. So that, what does that mean? What does that tell us? I don't know. I don't know what it tells us. But it's, as they say, counterintuitive. And it's not something anybody likes to look at. It's a little bit like the landlords during the Irish famine who went bankrupt keeping their people alive. We know a lot about cruel landlords, and God knows they existed, who drove their people off their land and so forth during the famine. But we don't hear about the others because it doesn't fit. The problem with these stories not fitting is that they make us uncomfortable.
We like things easy, clear cut, and that's it.
And the truth is, they never are. I mean, I have to leave you, as you know, but I'll leave you with these thoughts of the Buffalo Springfield about people carrying signs, mostly say, "Hooray for our side." We tend to think that our side is always right. But as the Buffalo Springfield further inform us in the same song, for what it's worth, that's the title, not just an observation on my part. But nobody's right if everybody's wrong.
Right.
And unfortunately, when you're an historian, you see far more examples of that than you would like to. But that goes back to fallen human nature and stupiditas omnia vincit.
Thank you very much, Charles. I appreciate it. God bless you.
You're welcome.
Take care.
We'll do this again. God bless. Bye-bye.